All right. Hello, everyone. Hope everyone's having a great Tuesday. So we'll get started just about now. So yeah, welcome. So we're going to be talking about tech interviews today. If you want to follow along with the slides, we have a short URL here, or if you want to take a look at them after. Yeah, so hi, my name is Ibrahim. I'm a 3B SE student. So in terms of questions, we have the YouTube live stream going. So feel free to just toss your questions in there. I'll be monitoring it throughout. Yeah, and we'll also have some time at the end for Q&A if you want any general questions. So yeah, so in terms of you guys, so most of you will probably be in 2A, either SE or CS, but there might be a few like 1A people out there too, so I'll try to cater to everyone. So yeah, so we'll give a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. So first off, why tech interviews? So why are we even bothering? Second, like what to expect. So hopefully you had some interviews before, but if you don't, just like what you should expect this time around. How to prepare. So I'll give you like exactly what you need to know, some common techniques for each, and maybe some sample problems if you want to look at those. We'll also go over like the general problem solving process and a walkthrough through a sample question. And then I'll give you some like general tips, and then we'll have Q&A at the end. So there's a bit of lag between the call here and the live stream. So I'm going to take a bit of pauses here and there to catch up with the chat. Cool. So let's start off with why tech interviews. Why should we even bother? And honestly, the alternatives aren't really that great. Tech interviews are just kind of weird. There's not really a great way to do it. This is kind of the best way we have right now. And basically, interviewers are just trying to determine like, is this person easy to work with? How do you communicate? How do you act when you get stuck? How to deal with hard problems? So all of that is what you should really focus on when you're doing your interviews. So we'll go more in depth as to like how to approach this. So what should you expect? So obviously this time around is a bit different. So I think Waterloo Works closed like this morning. So we're gonna have a shortened main round this time, I think. So you're gonna have interviews coming like hopefully thick and fast. So you might be getting coding challenges from a few. You'll probably have 2 to 3 tech interviews for like most like medium to large size companies. So nowadays it'll probably be remote. So you'll be on like the phone with like CoderPad. If you don't know what CoderPad is, it's like an interactive coding browser thing where you can like code alongside your interviewer. If you have an on-site, probably not now, but in the future, you're probably going to be on the whiteboard. It's like the typical interview style. And you might have like a behavioral or like a non-technical portion too. That's a bit less common, but those are good to prepare for as well. Cool. So how to prepare. So there's a lot of different things you can do. Here are the ones I've highlighted. So I think the most important thing is that you need to know like data structures really, really well. So it's all about like training yourself to go from like, oh, okay, so for this problem, I need to do like XYZ really fast. And then making that connection and being like, oh, okay, that means I'll probably need a hash table. So I'll talk about more about how you can do this a bit later. But other things that I use, LeetCode is like my go-to. Hopefully you're familiar with it. It's like this online platform for prepping for like interviews. CS courses are actually really good. So CS 341, that's algorithms. I really recommend that you like take a look at some notes if you want, or take that in the future. 240 is also really good. Books like CTCI, Cracking the Coding Interview, really good as well as mock interviews with friends. It's just a fun time as well to help both of you prepare. Cool. So what to study? So in this section, I'm going to go over like kind of everything you need to know, like an example problem for each, just like to give you some exposure on that, and just some like general tips on each. But I don't want to spend too much time on this. So I'm going to go a bit quickly, and hopefully you already have exposure to some of these. If you don't, that's okay too. So yeah, let's get started. So big annotation. So hopefully you've been grilled on this already in first year, but you really need to know how to identify common runtimes. So your solution should probably be in like the constant time to like the n log n range. That's just like general guideline. But yeah, you should be really, really comfortable with this. Okay, so for arrays, so arrays are like the most basic and common data structure. So I think like most of my interviews probably end up using arrays in some way, right? So an example problem you would get is, okay, let's say you want to find two numbers in an array that sum to n. This is like the most common problem ever. It's like the first one on LeetCode. So if you have like an array that's like 1, 2, 3, you're looking for two numbers to sum up to 3, right? So 1 and 2 would do that. So the 3 things that I picked out that you should know, first is how arrays are stored. So you should know like how the memory works. You should also know sorting and searching. So a bit more on that. So hopefully you've already seen sorting in first year. If you're in first year, don't worry, you're going to learn that pretty soon. But really focus on like merge sort and quick sort and the general algorithm, how they work. with searching, this is really, really important. I think, so linear search is pretty easy, but binary search, I think I've been asked it in so many interviews that I think it's really, really important to brush up on and just know the ins and outs of. So definitely practice that. Okay, so some common techniques. So this is kind of the stuff they don't really teach in the courses. So when you see an array problem, your mind should probably think of these kinds of things, right? So the two-pointer approach, hopefully you've heard of that before. But basically it's this approach that we're actually gonna talk about a bit later too, where you have like 2 pointers, normally one at the end, one at the beginning of an array, and you kind of work through the problem like that. Another is a sliding window approach. This is like, if you're trying to find like a subset, you can like move a window across the array. And then another heuristic you can use is like using details of the question, right? So if the question tells you the array is sorted, like you should have like alarm bells in your head going off like, okay, can I use binary search, right? Because binary search relies on the array being sorted. If it's not sorted, you can think of, okay, can I use a hash table to make this faster? Can I just do a linear search? Or can I even sort it beforehand and make it easier for myself? So this is kind of like the thinking you should like get used to when you come up against these kinds of problems. Cool, so I have some good problems here. So I picked out 3 for each topic. So I'm not gonna like spend too much time on this, but if you want to check out the slides later and like practice some of these for an area you're not so strong on, definitely do that. Cool, strings. So an example question for a string, this is also really common. It's like, oh, determine if a string is a palindrome, right? So it's the same forwards as it is backwards. So race car would be one, goose would not be, right? And the good news is that strings are basically just arrays. Hopefully you learned that in first year, that strings are just character arrays. So it turns out that all the common techniques that I mentioned for arrays apply to strings as well. So this slide is exactly the same as arrays, right? So you can sort strings, you can do binary search on them. All of that applies here too. Cool, I have some problems here too. Now, linked lists. So hopefully majority of, I think, first year CS courses talk about linked lists like a lot. So it's really, really important, but I think it's pretty easy. Most people, when they come to second year, or even like after their first term, they're pretty competent with linked lists. But you should really, really know how pointers work, how to create, index, insert, and delete. Hopefully you should already be familiar with that. Pros and cons versus arrays. So I've often been asked like, oh, why would you use a linked list here instead of an array? So you should be able to talk about the runtime differences, the memory differences, all of that. So then one kind of odd thing here, I listed a cycle detection algorithm. So there are like some certain problems out there that like you kind of just have to be aware of popular algorithms that use them. So I linked this one called Floyd's algorithm. It's really, really simple. It'll take you like 5 minutes to learn. I think it's just good to be aware about. Cool. Stacks and queues. So these are like a less common data structure actually. I've very rarely been asked about stacks and queues, but they're good to just know. So all you really need to know is FIFO versus LIFO. So an example would be like, oh, implement a queue class using only stacks. So yeah, they're definitely good to practice, but I think linked list, if you have those down, you pretty much have these down as well. Cool. Hash tables. So this is where we get into like the really, really useful data structures that you may or may not know going into second year. I can't remember if they teach these in first year. But anyways, these should be like your best friend when it comes to tech interviews. Like using hash tables just drastically improves like your solutions for like so many things, right? So for example, a problem would be like count the number of character occurrences in a string, right? So goose, G happens once, O twice, and so on, right? So the things you should know, what hashes are, how they work, how hash tables are implemented, maybe the difference between hash tables and hash sets would be good too. But really the most important thing you need to know is like, when do I use a hash table in my solution, right? Like, how do I recognize that like, oh, this would make my solution faster if I use a hash table? So to give you a bit of intuition, let's say like you want to store like the prices of various fruits, right? So if a banana is like 250 and so on. Let's say you use like 2 arrays for that. So you have an array of fruits like bananas, apples, orange. And then you had another array for prices. So this would be fine. But then if I asked you what's the price of an apple, you would have to like look through the entire fruit array and then be like, oh, okay, apple's here. The price of the apple is 150. So when you have these kinds of problems, arrays are really bad, right? You have to look through the entire array. But with hash tables, they're really good at exactly this, right? If you want to like access elements really, really quickly over and over again, then you're gonna need a hash table. This is like almost every question will use a hash table in like some sense, right? So what's the price of an apple here? You can do that in constant time because of the way hashing works. And if you're in first year and you're freaking out right now because you have no idea what a hash table is, that's totally fine too. You'll learn about it eventually. Cool. Now graphs. So this is a pretty broad topic. So the things you really need to know, basic graph trees like nodes, edges, all of that. Trees are really important. So binary trees, I think it's probably tied between binary trees and binary search for like the most common interview questions in my experiences. So definitely know those, know like tree traversals, alongside with GFS and BFS. I think that's really important too, and binary heaps as well. So just to give you some common techniques for graphs, for tree problems, if you come up against those, you're going to be using recursion like almost always. Like I struggle to think of a tree question where recursion is not used in like some sense. Along with that, for DFS and BFS, hopefully, so if you don't know what these are, which I don't think they even teach you in first year yet, but BFS and DFS are like ways to traverse graphs. So you should like be generally aware of them, maybe just read up beforehand. So you typically want to use BFS when you want to find like the shortest path between two like nodes, or the question asks you to do like a level order traversal. And almost every other time you want to use DFS. So hopefully when you're preparing, you can like refer back to the slide and it'll help kind of build those models in your head. Binary heaps useful when you want to keep track of like the min or the max of something. Cool. Dynamic programming. So this is where the tiers start coming. This is like the hard, the stereotypical like hard interview problems. But the good news is it's very uncommon, right? So I'm in 3B. I'm applying for like my 5th co-op now, and I think I've been asked a DP question maybe once. They're pretty tough, right? So this example here, like given coins of different values and a total amount, find like the fewest number of coins you need to make up that amount. So it's pretty tough. And the two things that you should know are like memoization and greedy. So one thing I will say here, you should definitely focus on like array strings, trees, linked lists first. And I wouldn't even bother with this until you're like really good with those. Because, you know, I've only been asked like one question on this ever, but it's good to be aware of anyway, especially when you graduate. It'll probably be a bit more common too. So to give you a bit more tips, always, I think, ask yourself if greedy would work first. If you don't know what greedy is, that's fine too. Another thing that really helped me is just realizing that dynamic programming is all about storing. So, you know, pre-computing values that you're going to need eventually, storing stuff you're going to need again. And yeah, basically just don't stress, because this is pretty uncommon for like, especially first and second co-ops. Cool. So I'm going to pause there just in case there's any questions in the chat. There's maybe like a 10-second delay. Cool. Yeah, so let's talk about the problem solving process now. So I think this, when I was in first year, I think if someone told me this, it'd probably be the most useful, even in second year as well. So it's kind of like how to approach interviews instead of like, I remember like my first few interviews, I went in and just like started coding immediately, and it was just terrible. There's a question in the chat now. It said, where will these slides be available? So there's I think we have a link in the description of this live stream. Oh, actually, I don't think we do, but here, there's a link right here, tiny.cc/UW Tech Interviews. Yeah, I think if someone can add that into the chat, that'd be awesome. Cool. All right, cool. Let's talk about the problem solving process now. So this is kind of like the process I use for like all of my interviews. It might seem a little stupid at first, but I'll explain the reasoning behind all of them. And I'll go through an example like as I do it. So let's say we have this question, right? The same question I mentioned before. So given an array of integers and a target, find if two numbers sum to the target, right? So this is called twosum. It's like really popular. You've probably heard of it before. So if I have this array right here, right, and my target is 10, I would return true because I have 1 and 9, which are two numbers that sum up to 10. 4 and 6 also work. Whereas 2, I would return false because there's no two numbers that add up to 2, right? So let's say I was given this in an interview. What would I do first, right? Definitely not code right away, right? So the first step that I always do is I always restate the problem. Even if it's like an easy question, I would say something like, oh, so we want to create a function that takes in blah, 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 returns, you know, XYZ based on this, right? Just restate it. You know, if you can't figure out the answer, you know, at least you got the question right. And I think it's really important to know that like in your interviews, they're really looking for good communication. So just to like start your interview off with like mutual understanding and like making sure you have the problem right is like really good. Cool. Step 2. ask questions, right? So the problem is normally going to be pretty ambiguous to start off with. So I would be asking things like, oh, can I have positive and negative numbers in the array? I would ask things like, is the array sorted? Can numbers repeat? And stuff like overflow is really good to ask about too, like really large or really small numbers. So you want to think about like edge cases or like special cases, and even like what to optimize for. So some of my interviews, um, there's the obvious one of like, oh, you should optimize for space or time. But some of my interviews even ask me to optimize for like readability, like ignore like the most optimal one in terms of like time, but go for like the most clear solution. So definitely ask about that. And I think one thing I will note here is that I've had coworkers in the past who did interviews, like they ran interviews for the company, and they even told me that they would sometimes like hold back important info about the question just to see if like the interviewee is going to ask about it. It just shows that you care about like properly scoping out the problem and everything. So definitely make sure you do this. Cool. Finally, not finally, number 3, restate the brute force. So for this problem, it's pretty simple, right? You look through all the pairs, which is an order n squared, a number of pairs, and just add them up, right? And just give yourself a starting point. Honestly, like especially when you're under nerves, it's just good to know that like, okay, let's make sure that I at least have like a starting point. Right? This solution works. It's not great, but it gets the job done. There's a question here. Will the stream be posted after 2? I'm pretty sure this will be recorded. I think this will be available on this very YouTube channel. So after the stream ends, I think you'll be able to watch it again. Cool. It also just shows logical thinking when you say the brute force, right? Like you don't have to like super rush and like find the most optimal solution as quickly as possible, right? Like you're really being judged on your problem solving skills, not like how quickly you get like the best answer, right? I've had like many interviews where I've like not even been close to like the right answer, but like my problem solving skills were like good. So definitely that's like a key takeaway from this. Cool. Now, step 4 is to optimize. So this is like definitely the hardest part, right? This is like the part where they're really looking to gauge your skills, right? So just like a simple way that you can go about it. Step 1, identify the problem would be really good. So this one's really easy. It's an array problem, but some might be more discrete, right? So like graph problems can often be disguised in other ways. So identifying that to start off is really good. Then asking yourself, be like, oh, okay, I know this is a graph problem. What techniques do I know that solve graph problems? Can I use DFS? Can I use BFS? Going in that kind of like logical approach and talking out loud when you do it would be really good. Because there's no real like set way to be like, okay, this is how you get the answer in every interview, right? You kind of have to rely on your instincts. If that doesn't work, maybe you can think of ways to like transform it into another problem. So as I said, like a lot of graph problems are kind of disguised. So maybe you approach it in one way first and then try a different approach after. That works too. So for this problem, I would be like, okay, it's an array problem, right? Maybe we can use a 2-pointer approach I mentioned earlier. So it turns out we can use that if the array is sorted. And I know I kind of just waved my hand there. In an actual interview, you have to work that out. But just to really quickly show you here, if I had this array and I started 2 pointers, one at the beginning and one at the end, and I was looking for a target sum of 9, I could just add up the value of the 2 pointers right now, which would get 10, and that's too big. But since the array is sorted, I can kind of like move in the pointers accordingly, right? So to get a smaller sum, I can move the right one in by 1. I'll get 7. That's too small, so I can move the left one up by 1, and then we get 9. So hopefully that makes sense. But that's like an example of like one of the techniques that you're not really going to learn in your courses, but doing these interview problems, you can like prep for these. Cool. And you often will get like follow-up questions as well. So a good one for this would be like, what if the input array wasn't sorted? Can you think of a better way? So I'll leave that for you guys, but hash tables would definitely come into play there. Cool. Now step 5 would be to code. This is normally where most of the time comes in the interview, right? So I think a really good thing that I only like recently started doing is I would ask beforehand your interviewer if your solution sounds good to them. I think it's really important to recognize that your interviewer is like there for you. Like they want you to succeed. They want to like nudge you in the right direction, right? So if you just said like, oh, I think the 2-pointer approach might work, I would be like, hey, does that sound good to you? Can I start coding? And if they give me a thumbs up, then you're good. Some general things here, like really obvious things, like use good variable names. I think it actually goes a long way. Like they want to see if you're going to be a good coworker, right? And you don't want to work with someone who like writes really hard to read code. If you're on a whiteboard, I've had multiple occurrences where I don't leave spaces between the lines. I have like arrows going everywhere. It's just a mess. Another really good thing to know is that when you're picking like which language to do your interviews in, know like how you can like create the common data structures really quickly. Like if you pick something like C++, like know which like things you'll have to include and like the structure of how you can like initialize a map, for example. So definitely make sure you do that. Cool. And then finally, you have to test, which is actually probably one of the most important steps. So test like the obvious cases, and don't forget about the edge cases that you might have asked about in step 2. And I think probably the most important thing I can say here is that we want to test like your written code, like the code you actually wrote. So this is more like applicable like when you're on a whiteboard. Nowadays, when we have like remote interviews, you might actually be writing your code. Make sure you actually like test what you wrote and not like what you said or what you thought of. And just literally just go line by line and test it out. Cool. Now I'm just gonna give some general tips of like stuff I've picked up over the few years. So I'll pause a bit for any questions, let the chat catch up. Cool. All right, let's talk about some tips. I think, okay, yeah, so I say that a lot of this is important, but I think talk out loud is like the #1 thing here. I think if you just like stay silent, your interviewer doesn't know like how to nudge you, right? Like if you like spend, like 5 minutes just thinking in your head, they won't know like what hints to give you to like push you in the right direction, right? So if you're always talking out loud, even if you have like no idea how to do the problem, then that would be great, right? Because then your interviewer can be like, oh, I think you're going in slightly of a wrong direction, right? Yeah, so someone asked me, can I share my co-op experience? Yeah, so first co-op, I worked at Thomson Reuters in Toronto. Second co-op, I went to Stripe. Third co-op, I was at Google. And just recently now, I was at Facebook. Cool. Second, I think slow down. So typically you have like an hour for interviews, sometimes half an hour, but honestly just taking your time, like not worrying about like, I need to get the most efficient solution as soon as possible and like my life depends on it. I think just like slowing down, like a lot of interviews, I just like didn't finish the code, but like my process was right and they didn't mind. Drawing diagrams is really good too. So if you're on a whiteboard, that really helps. Not really applicable if you're remote. Being confident, just like showing, like not second guessing yourself, but also being honest when you don't know is really good too. And I left a note here, like consider the most like readable solution as well, because I want to see how good you are to work with. And I think like when you're like actually writing code in like a production environment, you want to get like the best maintainable code, and like optimizing is not always the key highlight. And obviously just use your best language, right? Like, if you're best in Python, use Python. Cool, common mistakes. So I think immediately writing code, I've already kind of mentioned that, as well as this one, sacrificing code cleanliness just because you're trying to get the solution like ASAP, right? I think less worrying about that, and just like, you're just trying to show the interviewer that like you're a good candidate, you're a good engineer, right? That doesn't always mean like being super fast. Cool, so there's a question in the chat. Are there any resources you would suggest to learn useful techniques or common interview questions? So there's actually a slide at the very end, which I'll go through, which has like a bunch of resources. Cool. So another one is ignoring guidance from your interviewer. So if they tell you like, if they give you a hint or if they give you like a certain detail of the question, you totally ignore it, it's probably not the best thing because they probably say it for a reason, right? Obviously. As well as focusing too much on optimizing too early. I think I already mentioned that. And of course, being silent. I talked about the importance of like talking out loud already. Cool. So things interviewers love to hear. So this slide has a lot of words, but I'll just quickly go over a few of them. I think most of them are like showing that you reason about problems in the right way, right? Being like, oh, here are the trade-offs of this solution, but this one works better because of this one's better because of this. Identifying like, oh, if there's a bug in your code, like instead of like being in your head and being like, oh, I hope they don't notice, being like, oh, I think there's a bug because of this, right? Thinking about like, oh, how big can numbers be? Like thinking about the edge cases, all that's really good too. Yeah, so definitely go over these in detail if you want later on the slides. Cool. Now, I just mentioned here, so if you want some resources, these are really good. So the daily coding problem, I think it just emails you every day a different interview problem, like into your inbox. I don't personally use it, but I've heard it's pretty good for other people. LeetCode is my go-to. Yeah, quick note on that. I think a lot of people are like, oh man, I can't solve LeetCode hard questions. So I guess to give a bit more context on if you don't know what LeetCode is, you have like easy, medium, and hard interview problems on there. But honestly, easy and medium problems are like pretty much all you need. Like I've solved like not many hard problems and I've got by just fine. You can also do weekly contests if that interests you too. HackerRank is really good too. It's similar to LeetCode. It's more like contest focused from what I hear, but it works as well. Advent of Code, I've tried this once as well. So I think it like gives you like a interesting plot of like solving problems and that kind of takes you through it. And that's good too. But I think books are really good too. So I started off by reading CTCI, so Cracking the Coding Interview. That was like the first place I started. But if you're in university now, it may not be as useful because you'll probably learn a lot of this through school, but I definitely recommend it as well. Upper years are great too. Respond well to being dry with food, obviously in the post-COVID era. But another really interesting thing is CS 341 actually like covers like the nickname for that course, like the interview course, right? It teaches you like all the common like data structures and algorithms and graphs and all that, right? So if you want, I don't know how this would work in like COVID where it's like remote school life, but you can like show up to a section and just listen along and you'll take something away from that. Cool, so we are, I didn't anticipate that this would take the entire hour. So I think we're pretty good on time. So yeah, that's pretty much all I had. If you have any questions, I'm gonna hang around for maybe like 3 minutes. We'll just take a look at the chat. But besides that, best of luck on your interviews. Cool, I think there's a question now. What would you do if you're drawing a blank or get stuck during an interview? Yeah, that's a pretty good question. I think what I mentioned before, where like, just to like preface this, like I've blanked out my interviews like countless number of times. I think just like talking out loud, being like, oh, like this is where my head's going. I don't think this will work because of this. And just honestly just keep talking it out and your interviewer just like kind of nudge you, hopefully, if they're like a good interviewer. If they're not, they'll just watch you struggle. Yeah, I don't know. That's like the best thing I can suggest for that. Cool. Any particular questions you've seen a lot in interviews? I think, okay, so I think the one that I covered, like to some, where you have like the array, I've been asked it like 2 or 3 times. It's like the first question on LeetCode. I don't know if interviewers just don't want to scroll down. But yeah, that was really common. I think binary search, like related questions are like insanely common. Binary trees as well. I think the lesser common ones would be like linked lists, dynamic programming, stacks and queues. But yeah, I think trees is probably like #1 though. Cool. Did I apply to my previous co-ops through WarnerWorks or externally? Any tips on how to secure the interview with these big companies in the first place? Yeah, that's a great question. So the first part, did I apply through WarnerWorks or externally? I think for 2 of them, I applied through WarnerWorks and 2 of them was external. But honestly, I don't think it really matters. Like, I think either way is fine. Like, I wanted to apply externally because I wanted to apply a bit earlier. Like, for example, like Google's like notoriously, famous for taking forever with their interview cycles. So I applied to them externally. But honestly, either works. So any tips on how to secure the interview? So yeah, the process of like securing the interview is like a whole nother topic on its own. So like your resume is like the #1 thing, right? Like if so this is probably like your first or second co-op for most of the people watching this. Um, Honestly, so I think one important thing to note in like first and second year is that you have 6 co-ops and you have plenty of time to get these interviews with the bigger companies. I think I was in particular very impatient as well, and like I wanted to just like get interviews as soon as possible. But honestly, if it doesn't happen now, you have plenty of time. I think any tips would be like go to like the SE resume critiques. We just had one now, but messaging any upper years, like you can message me as well to critique your resume. I'll gladly help you out. Yeah, that's what I can say about securing interviews. Cool. Another question. Should we go out of our way to search for external co-ops? If so, where are some good places to look? Great question again. So it's a bit hard to say now because it's like kind of a weird time with COVID. I think it's generally a good idea to apply externally. Like I like it just because there are some companies that don't post on Waterworks always. And if I apply early before the other students come, it'll maybe, less apps might get me noticed quicker. I don't really know. I think the best place would be if you want to apply externally, just on the company website, right? So like some people like spend hours like DMing recruiters on LinkedIn. Like I don't think that's a good use of your time. I think that's like, DMing recruiters or like cold calling, like emails, not the best use of your time. I think like companies build like application portals because it's like the best way for them to evaluate candidates, right? So just use it. Yeah, I think that's how I applied to Google. I just applied on their website like a few weeks before Waterworks opened. Cool, great questions though. Yeah, so someone mentioned I like looking on LinkedIn, and yeah, so there are a lot of GitHub resources as well. So that's a great point. So there are GitHubs, like people like create like interview guides. So not only like problems, but also like compiled lists of like applications, like which companies are hiring currently, and they're like pretty up to date. So if I find any, I'll like go back and add these to the end of these slides. Yeah, definitely a really good point there. Those are really good tips as well. Yeah, I think if you're also looking for companies to apply to, I think if you're looking for like a startup, I think Angel List, I think it's called, is like a really good place. That's really good too. Okay, cool. Another really great question from Robbie. How often do you practice LeetCode? And are there any beginning of interview season routines that you have? Yeah, that's a really good question. I think this is like especially relevant right now because I think Waterworks just like finished this morning. I think it's like before my first interview, I normally spend like more time prepping. So it's like, after 4 months of not doing any interview prep, you get pretty rusty. So yeah, I think that's definitely something to note. Like before your first interview, you probably have to spend more time. And then after that, like, especially now where you're going to have like a week or two of like a lot of interviews, probably, you can probably like not prep as hard in between each. But I think like, so a month before, I probably like prep on like the data structures and stuff. A week before, probably just like do some legal problems. But like the night before, it's tough to say. Like I think I just like research about the company in particular, like what kinds of questions they might ask, what they value, stuff like that. Yeah, that's kind of what I'll say about that. I don't really like to like cram the night before. Like I think going in with a clear mind is pretty helpful. Like being like calm, and yeah, that's just my style. Other people work in different ways. Yeah, cool. Another question. Okay. Can you speak a bit on behavioral interviews and coding challenges? Okay. So non-technical interviews are kind of weird. Um, so there's like this whole like term of like culture fit. Like they're trying to find whether or not you'd be a good like fit for their place. But honestly, it's really just like code for saying, are you a nice person? Like, do you like know your resume? Can you talk about like your past projects? Are you like nice and friendly to interact with? Like I generally think that's like a big thing that companies look for. Like, are you like a kind person? So that's like the only thing I can really say about that. Like knowing your resume really well. Like, um, I think we've all been like in an interview. Some people just really like to ask about like all your past experiences and the bullet points on your resume. So I would know those really well. Coding challenges are a bit weird as well. Like, not every company does them. I think it's a pretty rare. Yeah, it's hard to give advice on coding challenges. You kind of just have to like sit down and do them. It's like you don't really know what to expect. Yeah, I don't know. Like I'm not the best at coding challenges either. So yeah, I don't know. I can't speak too much on that. Yeah, another really great point in the chat. Grace Hopper Conference is a great opportunity if you're a woman in tech, to like make connections and stuff like that. So definitely a great resource there too. Any tips for remote interviews using CoderPad? That's a great question too. I think, yeah, so there's like a bunch of things that you can do for like remote interviews. I think there's like obvious things like, oh, like have like a stable internet connection and whatnot. But I think, yeah, I think getting familiar with CoderPad is good too. Like if you never used it before, just like knowing how to like change the language and like run your code. But hopefully they'll like walk you through it beforehand. Yeah, I don't know. I think most of the stuff is like pretty much the same. I think getting used to the mindset of like, it's like when I'm prepping for like an interview in person, I normally like write out my solutions because I'm prepping on like writing on a whiteboard. But for remote, I normally like code it out and actually run it because that's what I'm expecting to do with CoderPad, right? It's kind of a different style where like in like a whiteboard interview, they're not going to care about like, oh, what's that library name, what's the data structure name? They're going to be like, oh, okay, just make up whatever. Like it doesn't really matter. But if you're actually running your code, it actually matters. So there's like a bit of a change of mindset there. So yeah, that's what I'll give there. Another question: how big of a role do the behavioral questions play in the decision? Even in a tech interview where they might just be asking like one behavioral question at the beginning. Also, does charisma improve chances? That's a great question. I think I'm under the belief that like, so for example, for like the Facebook interviews, I think there was like, I don't think there was a single like non-technical question. I don't think they cared that much. I don't know. I think a lot of companies also just get like a general feel for you as you like work through a problem. Like, is it nice working through problems with you? Like, are you like polite and stuff like that? I don't think like being like super charismatic like drastically improves your chances. You know, if you like totally fail the actual technical interview, I don't think a nice handshake will improve your chances that much. Yeah, but I think just like generally being like a nice person like does help for sure. And I think it's just a good thing. Okay, another question. If you're being interviewed for a web dev job, how much do they test you on your knowledge on some concepts or a specific framework? That's a great question. Yeah, so that's something I didn't really touch on. So some interviews do have like a trivia portion. So like let's say, so this example here is like web dev, right? So for some web dev interviews, they'll ask you like, oh, like, can you describe like how like a database works or how an API works or like what frameworks you would use for the front end? I think these are like, yeah, these are less common. So I think if you're applying for like a front end job, like a strictly front end job, it's probably a lot more common for you to get these kinds of questions. But if you're applying for back end, which is mainly what I've applied to, I've not really gotten these kinds of questions that much. Like maybe a bit of knowledge, but not too much. Like most of it has been like these sorts of like LeetCode problems. I think yeah, I think it would just be good in general, just to like brush up on common terms, though, which you probably should already be aware of, though. Cool. Yeah, another comment on that is generally they might ask you some like specifics about the framework, but they probably won't have you like actually whiteboard and like write out the questions. That's a good comment in the chat. Another question: what was my favorite co-op so far and why? Uh, cool. And a follow-up question: what was your least favorite co-op so far and why? So these are great questions. I think each one has its pros and cons. I think Google is definitely like a standout favorite for me, just because I really enjoyed my team. Like I was working on Google Assistant, which was really interesting to me. Like I was able to work on like user-facing code. I really like my team. My manager was super nice. I think Google was great. Least favorite is tough. Least favorite is tough. I'm gonna have to go with Facebook, like just now. And not that I have anything against Facebook. Just for the record, I know this is going to be out publicly, but just because I think of remote, right? So a remote co-op is obviously tough. It's tough to like connect with like your team to ramp up quickly. So it's like hard for me to give like a fair evaluation on Facebook. But just the fact that it was remote and that I was at home instead of like in the office, I would have to say Facebook, unfortunately. So good question though. Cool. Any other questions? These are great questions. How different was the remote experience? Yeah. So yeah, if you're in second year, I guess your first co-op would have been remote, and if you're in first year, your first co-op will probably be remote as well, unless things change. I think it was hugely different. So I think the pros, I'll give you some pros and cons. Like for me, the pros were like I just had like total control of my schedule. I'm sure a lot of you are finding this for like your school now, like not having set lecture times mean like you can stay up until 3 a.m. and wake up whenever you want, right? It was a bit different for that for like me, like because I was on the Eastern time zone and my team was on the West Coast. So there's a bit of time difference I had to account for too, but it worked out pretty well with like my schedule. And I think there was just like less pressure for me to like work a set 8-hour day rather than a couple hours here, a couple hours there. I think I really like that flexibility. Like if I had to like go run an errand, I can just do that. I enjoyed that. Working like while my parents cooked me food was awesome. I think some downsides were like you don't get any of the company perks, of course, but that's not a huge deal really. I think the bigger thing is just like you don't really get to connect with like your coworkers, right? Like for me, it was like I talked with my manager and like a couple coworkers, but that's about it. I didn't really meet the rest of my team super well, or like other interns as well. I didn't really get that like intern cohort experience. Um, yeah, I mean, I was still grateful to like have an internship in the end anyway, though. So it wasn't a huge deal. Yeah, cool. I need more questions. Can I share what I've heard about Step for Google or maybe even Microsoft Explorer? Yeah, great questions. So for those of you who don't know, I think so Google and Microsoft in particular have first year programs, I think first and second year programs, where these are like kind of different internships that are designed just for like first and second years, where like the structure is a bit different. I think, so I've never done one of these, but I do have friends who have, and they've had great things to say. Like, I don't know, I think it's really good to get that experience, but I think like there are pros and cons to it too. Like working at a big company so early, um, like you may not have like I really enjoyed working at like smaller companies to start off with, and kind of like working to the bigger companies. Totally my personal preference though. But yeah, I've heard great things. The question is asking me what I want to share what I've heard. I've heard great things, so definitely apply to those. How do I feel about writing cover letters? Do they really give you an advantage? Are they worth the time spending on them? That is a fantastic question. I hate cover letters. I think they are absolutely god awful. And when I see a company requires a cover letter, I just don't apply. I used to do cover letters, but then I don't know. I just feel like a company should like respect your time. I think coding challenges are also a little bit sketched. Like I don't know, like you're giving like over an hour of your time with a coding challenge to a company in return for like nothing. With the cover letter, it's like I don't know, like I don't know what I would say in a cover letter that isn't on my resume, like in terms of my qualifications. But like the one case where I can see like a cover letter might be useful if it's like a really specialized job, like something you really like and you're really interested in. In that case, I would write a cover letter. But like for me personally, it doesn't make sense. Yeah. But I think that's one thing. Like if you are writing cover letters, don't like copy and paste. I did that in like high school when I was applying to jobs. I just like copied and pasted like a template, and it's just awful. So definitely just like right from the heart if you do that. Cool. Cool. A lot of people are entering remote co-ops this next term. Any advice for doing remote co-ops? Yeah. So I already touched on like some pros and cons, but I think defining a set schedule would be really good. Like I failed to do that last term. Like I didn't really say like, oh, I'm going to work from like 9 to 5. I kind of just like picked up my laptop whenever, and I feel like my balance kind of wasn't the best there. Like and there were some days where I didn't work the set amount of time. Some days where I went way over. Um, so I think that's definitely a thing. Like managing your time, and same goes for school too, right? Like everyone's on or most people are on like remote school right now. Just like managing your time would be really good. I tried really hard to like ramp up quickly with my co-op. I think ramping up is probably the hardest thing when you're remote because like when you normally ramp up for an internship, right? Like I feel like in the first few days, I'm just like talking to my manager, like my peers, like the entire time, just like debugging things. Like you have like tech problems, you have like permissions, and like you don't know what's going on. Everything's on fire. It's just bad. So I think uh, like giving some time early on to like really understand things would be really helpful. What are my future goals in regards to where I want to co-op? Where do I see myself a few years down the road? Okay, cool. A pretty personal question here. I think my goal for co-op is like try different things, try out different companies, different sectors. Like I feel like I've got a taste of like web dev and backend infra and like security. It'd be nice to try something different. Um, yeah, maybe I see myself a few years down the road. I don't know. I'll be graduated in like 2 years, so maybe hopefully work in a company if the world is still intact by then. That'd be great. Yeah, yeah. Nothing really special in terms of my goals. Yeah, I guess working on a startup would be cool. I guess. Yeah. Cool. My background is mostly web and full stack. How can I best transition to other fields without experience? Yeah, great question. I think, yeah, I think so. The number one thing for me is like I didn't have much experience like applying to my first few jobs. So I like worked on a lot of projects. So I wanted like a web dev job. So I did a lot of projects, for example. You say you have like mostly web and full stack development experience, like try out projects in like backend and like put them on your resume if they're worth it. If you want to do mobile, like make a mobile app, like it's free to do it, like anyone can do it. That's like my like best advice. Like work on projects that interest you, like learn what you want to learn. It's never been easier to like work on projects and learn online. Yeah, cool. Any other questions? Cool. Yeah, I'll hang around for a few more minutes. Yeah, if there are any more questions, drop them in the chat. But best of luck in your interviews. I hope it all goes well. Like, if you ever want to reach out to me, you can contact me on like Facebook, or if you're in SE, I'm probably in one of your channels, like Discord or something. Yeah, best of luck. Thanks for listening. If you have any more questions, drop them in the chat. I'll be here for a bit longer too. Thanks. Cool. We have one more question. I hope everyone can hear me. I think I'm unmuted. Yeah. How can I transition to full stack area if I don't have any experience besides building my portfolio website? So yeah, so I was in that exact position. Like I wanted to transition to full stack when I had like no experience whatsoever. So what I did was I worked on a lot of like personal projects. So like I made a portfolio website. I made like random websites for other people if they wanted it. I think so. What I did in high school, I used to like freelance. So I used to like hit up random like restaurants or like businesses, like small businesses if they wanted like new websites, and just like do them for like little cost. That's like really good way to get experience too. Um, yeah, I think online courses work too if that's like your style. Yeah, another comment there. Hackathons are great. Um, yeah, like doing hackathons are like a great way to get like a glimpse into like a new stack. Um, yeah, but I definitely think I still stand by like projects, especially for web dev. Like it's just like a way to get like a tangible way to show like your skills and like learn something along the way. So that's what I'll say about that. Yeah. Definitely projects for sure. Yeah, another comment in the chat. You can also find opportunities in like design teams and clubs. That's a great comment. Yeah, if there's like a specific team that you're interested in, like if you want to do like embedded, there's like a lot of embedded teams, like autonomous and stuff. Yeah, that's great too. Yeah. Okay, cool. I think we're just about done. Thanks everyone for watching. Hopefully this was helpful. Feel free to reach out to me or anyone on SESOC if you have any questions. Or another quick question in the chat: are hackathons going to happen this year? I don't know. I've heard a few of them are like remote, so you like do them from home. Yeah, but anyway, hopefully this was helpful. Thanks for the great questions and good luck on your interviews.